Have you been thinking about starting a podcast, but maybe you don't know where to start? Or maybe you're an existing podcaster who's kind of hit a wall and doesn't really know where to take your show next or how to grow your show. Well, you are in the right place because my guest on the Camera Confident podcast today is Amanda Cupido of Lead Podcasting. She's got a fresh new book out where she dives into all things podcasting, what is working in podcasting right now. So you're not going to want to miss this conversation with Amanda, where we talk about everything from how to start your podcast, what you need to know, and how can you really grow your show in 2025 and beyond. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Amanda Cupido. Welcome to the Camera Confident Podcast. Amanda, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Shirlee.
Welcome to the Camera Confident Podcast. I'm so excited to interview you today about all things podcasting. A lot of people listening are either beginner podcasts, maybe they have had a podcast for a little while, maybe they're thinking of starting a podcast. Before we jump into it though, why don't you give us your elevator pitch, tell us who you are and what you're all about.
So my name is Amanda Cupido. I am an author, entrepreneur, and TEDx speaker. I wrote the book, Let's Talk Podcasting, The Essential Guide to Doing It Right, which is second edition is just coming out, but first edition was an Amazon #1 bestseller. And I'm also the CEO of Lead Podcasting, a podcast production company making shows for thought leaders and organizations, and an adjunct professor in the School of Media at Seneca Polytechnic in Toronto.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you know a thing or two about podcasting.
Yeah, you could say that.
I feel a little bit intimidated and a bit of imposter syndrome right now because at the time of this recording, this podcast is about 5 months old. You and I have talked a lot before. We've become fast friends. Can you rewind for us? How did you get into this whole thing and what appealed to you about podcasting?
Well, I'm going to rewind many years back to when I was a kid, calling into radio stations and with my little cassette player, recording my segments when they aired, when I was talking to the jock that was on the air. And so I would have, people made mixtapes back then with songs they liked, but I was making a mixtape of talking on the radio, which I consider a very early podcast. So,
yes.
I was drawn to audio storytelling from a very young age for as long as I could remember. I then grew up just playing with the medium, and into high school, I was doing the announcements. Once I went to university at Toronto Metropolitan University, I studied journalism, and that's where I created my first podcast. So that was in 2009, 2010. They were not popular back then. I felt like the audio nerd that was just banging on about this thing called podcasts. And then I went into radio. And so, on the side, I continued making podcasts. And then in 2014, things really changed in the industry, and I started really tracking it from a serious business perspective. And I then wrote my book in 2018, the first edition, and then launched my business in 2020. So here we are.
I don't think a lot of people realize what goes into creating a podcast when they think, I want to start a podcast. All the entrepreneurs I talk to, almost every single one either has a podcast or wants to start a podcast. So what is the #1 piece of advice that you have for entrepreneurs who are thinking of starting a podcast because they want to grow their visibility? What advice would you give them right out of the gate?
I would say don't forget those 2 first steps that I mentioned, show development and episode mapping. I think one of the common mistakes I see is that people have an idea for a specific episode and a specific guest or a specific outcome that they're looking for, and they just jump right in, which is great because it's so accessible. And I do want to encourage people to jump in. But if you skip some of those foundational steps, you're not setting yourself up for success. So something like sitting down and talking about who is my target audience? Are they on YouTube and should I make a video podcast? Or actually, are they listening to audio only more? And maybe I'm going to focus on that, right? There's some key decisions that will help you in formatting your show. And so if you take that time for the branding of the show, the strategic way you're producing it, then you can get to the exciting bits of who do I want to have on it. But don't forget that first step, which is sometimes, unfortunately, what gets missed.
I love that you mentioned YouTube. Obviously, I'm a video gal. This is a video podcast. We will get to that. But I want to just take a step back first and talk about the quality of podcasts. You've been around in this business for a long time, and there's this perception that you should just get a mic and start. Just start talking. That's how a lot of some of the top podcasters got started. They grabbed a mic, they started talking. It was a different time. So can you talk about how is podcasting different now, starting a podcast? We're talking in 2024, we're about to enter 2025. How has it changed in your view?
Yes. So I will say out of the gate that it's people really think about podcasts only over the last decade, but really we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of podcasting this year. The first podcast as we know it came out in 2004. And that's when the word podcast was coined. So it's been 20 years. A lot has happened. A lot has changed. So of course, just like the .com boom with bloggers, in the beginning, it was easier to rise to the top because there was less content out there. People were experimenting and there was a little bit more forgiveness in those early days of figuring things out. But now that we have more of an established base, you do have this expectation to start with a little bit more professionalism than maybe some of the success stories previously. And also trends have changed. So here's an example. In the early days of podcasting, they really mimicked radio. And so there would be a produced introduction where it had music and a recording of maybe even a big booming voice introducing the podcast. And it would be the same pre-produced intro that went at the beginning of every single episode. And that's common for the radio stations to introduce a show. But as podcasting has evolved, that has fallen away. So now we're seeing that best practices include a self-introduction from a host, no big booming external voice, maybe just a little bit of music and a very short intro that you just get into your show fast because people are busy. We want the meat and potatoes, right? So that's a trend that has evolved. And so some shows have this legacy intro now that is just part of their fabric, and great, let them keep doing it. And that's fine for that show. But if you were to start now, it would be expected that you're kind of coming in at the current trend, which is a self-introduction.
I love that. And I have an example of that from my own podcast. So one of the big things I talk about and I'm about to run a challenge on is called a sizzle reel. It's your about me introduction. And I put that at the beginning of my podcast because, video gal. And what I observed on YouTube was a noticeable drop in viewer retention. When I had that, it was only 45 second intro on my early episodes.
There you go.
And once I took that away, and I have now what we call in the TV lingo a stinger. It's just like a quick 3 to 5 second, you're listening to, you heard it at the beginning of this podcast. And that allows you to retain those viewers who are like, here we go again. Because I hear you. There's a couple of podcasts that I listen to that I'm a big fan of. And there's always that 30-second fancy, highly produced intro. And so you hear that and you think, well, those are big, successful podcasts. So that's probably something I should do. But what you're saying is absolutely not. As it stands right now, that could actually hurt your podcast.
Yeah, that's correct. And thanks for pulling back the curtain on your own stats. I think that's really brave of you, but also this is in the spirit of helping people. And so I love that. And it's true. And sometimes when you're modeling yourself after the people and shows that you love, it's great. You can learn a lot from them. But yes, there was this difference of those who kind of started and launched in an earlier chapter. And then some of those best practices have evolved, and it might not work the same way for your show if you're launching now.
Absolutely. So let's talk about content, because the pillars of this podcast are what to say, how to say it, and how to create buzz. You kind of cover all of those. When we're talking about what to say, how do you recommend people go about approaching the idea of developing that podcast framework, that strategy, those pillars that they're going to talk about week to week or month to month or whatever frequency they land on?
I think this is a really great thing to hone in on, and it goes into this show development phase that I say that is commonly missed, especially if you have something like a one-person show where it's just you talking and you want to share bits about your life or advice, and it's easy for people to do their first episode and almost like give away everything in one episode, and they don't go deep. They skim over the whole story rather than really segment segmenting out what are you saying in each episode. And this is the importance of what I call episode mapping. That's step 2. So you're going to look at, and perhaps if someone's going to commit to like, let's just call it 8 episodes. This is a nice foundation. If you don't know if you can be constantly pumping out an episode and being always on, as they say in the industry, you could commit to a season, 8 episodes, or whatever number feels realistic to you. Then before you even start recording, you're going to map out what each episode is going to be about. And that even coming up with an angle for each episode and clearly defining what that is going to help you be able to make sure that each episode is distinct. And if, let's say you really want to go longer, that's okay. Timing can change. But also if you really think something deserves more, you could do a part 1 and a part 2 and strategically market it that way. And so really what you want to think about is, who is my audience and what are they going to find interesting? And then making sure you go deep enough into that so that you're not just skimming the surface of a topic, and you're really being able to give the audience what they want, which is like either tactical takeaways or things that they're going to learn, right? We know people listen to podcasts because they want to be entertained, but they also want to learn. So there should be a clear takeaway from every single episode.
One of the things that I hear conflicting advice about is this whole idea of niching down. This is a big thing in the YouTube world as well. Some people will say, oh, you got to pick a really super targeted niche because the riches are in the niches. Or there's people who are like, well, you want to be more of a generalist because then you'll call in more people and you can grow faster. What's your guidance for entrepreneurs who maybe don't necessarily have their ideal listener or viewer avatar mapped out right from the get-go?
I think you need to think about if it's not your ideal listener, it's your ideal customer. And that you should have mapped out if you're an entrepreneur, right? And even if it's a little bit broad, it should still be pretty specific. And I am on team niche in general. So podcasting, a lot of people will come and say, well, I want to just talk to interesting people. That's amazing. But you know what? You're up against celebrities who are talking to interesting people. So how are you going to cut through the noise? And it depends what you define as success ultimately, right? If you want to just talk to interesting people because that's going to open doors for your business relations and you actually are not concerned with charting on Apple or getting a lot of listeners, then great. Do your podcast, invite interesting people, and then hopefully turn a cold lead into a warm one. And that could be a tactic in and of itself and good for you. And you don't have to niche down. You do that. Others who are truly wanting to see podcast success in a more traditional sense where they're charting or they're being able to get a certain number of listeners are going to have to really be specific on how they're positioning themselves within the broader landscape. And so, for instance, if you're based in a certain country, we're in Canada, look at the Canadian landscape because Apple Podcast charts in every country. So if you want to chart in Canada, what else is in the Canadian landscape? And maybe you can find a gap that's there. Or if you are wanting to go within a niche with regard to a business, an international sense, you might want to do some SEO research on what are people Googling with regard to that niche? What is the number one thing that people are searching for information about? And maybe you're going to craft your podcast to target that specific niche within your industry. So there's different ways to going about it, but I do think you have to set out what are your ultimate goals of your podcast and then let some of those other decisions follow suit.
A lot of people also struggle with how long should episodes be? Is it better to have guests or be solo? So what are some of your tips for those early decisions that really set the tone of your podcast from day one?
Yeah, it's a good question and I get it a lot. And there is no one specific answer. That's the real, giveaway here is there's no right or wrong. That's the beauty of podcasting. And you could change it at any time. I make a lot of comparisons between podcasting and radio since that was my background. And in radio, you have a clock. You got to go to commercial break. And in podcasting, you could go for as long or as little as you like. So first off, take the pressure off of having a specific time you want to hit because that's fabricated. You don't need to have that. Some episodes can be a little longer. Some can be a little shorter. I'm a big fan of giving the content what it deserves. If you're having an interview and you feel like you've gotten all the information you need from your guest, wrap her up. Don't feel like you have to hit some magic number in your head and vice versa. If you've hit the mark that your 30-minute mark that you've put in your head, that's your limit, but the interview is so good, maybe you let it go for a little longer and don't be so hard on yourself. But the reality is, you should pick something that's going to align with what kind of content you're sharing. So if you're individually talking as a one person show, then maybe your episodes are going to be a bit shorter than when you have versus having a conversation with someone. There's just more to say and more to probably cover. And I would say, let the data speak for itself. Your audience is going to tell you, because different audiences are attracted to different lengths of time. I love to use the example of hardcore history. For those history buffs out there, they love a good history story. And those episodes are 3 hours, 5 hours long, one guy talking, right? And it's like, it's not for me. But dedication, and they listen, and that makes sense for that audience. So great, but if you're an entrepreneur and you're talking to C-suite executives who are probably busy and maybe only are going to be listening to this on their morning run, then you're going to have to tailor it to that audience, right? And so you just got to do a little bit of thinking and putting yourself in the audience's shoes, and then hopefully that will inform how you're going to format the show.
When we're talking about episode structure, how important is it to have a structure and a script for your podcasts? Because I'm someone who loves to interview people. I did not script this podcast. We're having a conversation. But some people really need that structure. They need a script. They can't wing it. So what's your advice to people, especially from a camera confident kind of viewpoint, where they're like, I need something that I can follow, that I can read?
I always encourage an intro and extra or outro, however you want to talk about it, a script for the beginning and the end. You want that to feel really buttoned up and concise, and you want it to hit the nail on the head. And so that, even if you end up memorizing it later and not needing to read it, but it should be pretty formulaic at the minimum, no matter what kind of show you have. That's a really important piece. So I always encourage that. And I do have templates for that in my book for people to get started. And then what happens in the middle, it really depends on the person and the type of story they're trying to tell. Sometimes I think it is better to have a script, especially if you're doing something like a narrative podcast. You need a script where you're throwing to clips and it's very journalistic. But then sometimes when you're having a conversation, it depends on the comfort level of the host. The number one priority is making the host feel comfortable. And maybe that means you're starting with a script and then slowly moving away from one. What I like to say is an ideal place to be is to have a list of what I call milestone topics. So this is where you're not scripting specific questions, because sometimes you then get too married to that specific question and you're not able to actively listen, and you miss out on opportunities for other neat questions to ask. But you have topics that you want to hit. And this is how a lot of the pros do it. And so you will have maybe 4 or 5 topics, and they don't have to go in that order, but that you want to make sure you ask a question about these, and then you let organic conversation follow. And what I like to encourage people to do is, think about yourself in conversation when you're at your best, whether that's at home or at a party. And that's the energy you want to emulate. And how can you get yourself there? And if in the beginning you need some notes, then do that. But ultimately, I do think that people sound best in interviews when they don't have a rigid script.
Totally agree. On the other hand, you do want to make sure your questions are not, and I'm thinking of our journalistic days, because you and I both have journalism backgrounds, those double or triple or quadruple barreled questions that go around the corner and come back, and then and you're like, was there a question in there? Podcasting is also a conversation, right? So as a host, you don't just want to fire questions. You want to show your personality. You want to tell stories in between questions, or give examples or metaphors or context, make the conversation interesting, right? So people can actually grab on and relate. So the actual wording of the questions, while you don't want to script it, you do want to practice. If you're not someone who does this often, or you haven't mastered this skill, there is a skill to asking questions, right? And
Definitely.
So what I did right there, was that a question?
No, but I love this. It's reflection. And you know what? This is a great example. Let's call it out right now. There's 2 types of hosts. There's the expert host and there's a facilitator host. You surely are an expert host. You're also in broadcasting. You also have a podcast. So you are not only someone who's asking me questions and facilitating a conversation, but you do have information to provide. And that kind of dynamic means that the host is going to talk more. Yes, they're going to tell those stories. And you want to see that come through. On the other side, side, there are types of hosts where they're just facilitators, and that's where they want to be really pointed with their questions. Their job is to lift the guest, not make it about themselves. And that's a very journalistic approach, which sometimes still will serve in a podcast sense, just depending on what the goals are of the podcast and your positioning as a leader. So here's an example. If you're an entrepreneur and you want to have a podcast and you don't have the capacity to host, you might hire an external journalist to host your podcast. And that's where they're going to be in that latter position of facilitating, and you're always the guest and you're just being lifted. And that host is not really telling stories. They're just going to be peppering you with questions and letting you take up 80-90% of the air of that podcast episode. So there's two different tracks you could take. And again, being strategic from the beginning on which one are you going to go down is really important.
I love that you say that. And when we think about, the constraints of journalism, you were talking about episode length. And one thing that I always struggled with as a journalist was keeping my stories to that magical 2-minute mark. Daily television news on the broadcast that I was on, we couldn't go over 2 minutes. And what that often meant was cutting out critical words or silences, pauses that were so strategic and effective. But, on the cutting room floor, something's got to go. And so you're squeezing yourself into this box. And I found the product would often suffer. So I love that you said that with podcasts, when I first started mine, I was like, I want everything to be under 10 minutes. It was like in my head. Yeah. Every episode and you know what? My solo episodes started to go up to 12, 14, longer. And, there was nothing to cut.
Yeah. I'm glad you changed. See, that's good. It's growth.
Exactly. Learning on the go. Okay. Yeah. Speaking of growth, I want to talk about video versus audio podcasts, because this is a question that we talk a lot about inside my program, Camera Confident Academy. It's something I'm personally learning as I go. There was an age where you had an audio podcast, you put it on YouTube, you slapped on the photo cover art of your podcast and called it a day. I know that definitely that makes me cringe, because that's not how podcasts should be presented on YouTube. But I'd love to hear your advice on people who want to have a video element to their podcast, but then they also have the audio element, because I'll pull back the curtain on my podcast. I've noticed I tend to promote the YouTube version, and I've seen a bit of a drop in the audio downloads. So can you talk a little bit about that?
And I'm not surprised. You're not the only one who comes up against this. It's tough, right? You want to have one clear call to action when you're promoting, especially on something like a social media channel. And it's hard to put more than one link, because ultimately people will not click every single one of them. And so I think it's about prioritizing from the beginning which one is the most important. And a fun fact, the word priority, its roots mean one. It's singular. Priorities is something we've made up over the years. It's meant to be one. And because how can you have more than one priority? Doesn't make sense, right? So what is your priority? Is it video? And if it is, you got to push that video hard, and you're going to be making those brilliant thumbnails, and you're going to point to it multiple times. And if it's audio, then you do have to start pointing directly to that. You're going to have to make smart links so that people can click it and it'll open up in whatever podcast player they use on their phone. There's a whole tactic into promoting the audio side. And so making and you could still have both, but just know, where am I pointing all of my call to actions towards instinctively, right? So with video, I think there's a lot of potential. We know lots of people love podcasts that are on YouTube, and there is a lot of room for growth, and YouTube themselves are calling for podcasters. They're making more podcast abilities within the platform available. There's actually, even as of this year, the ability to take your audio, and YouTube will automatically convert it into a video file so that you can host it on YouTube as well. Like, they really are trying to promote podcasters to come. So there's definitely more to come on that front. And so I would say that's a great place if you think your listeners will go there first. If you would like to go to the audio side, like I said, making a smart link is really important, so that when they click it, they'll have the options and go into their specific podcast player, because that is tough. It's like if you have Apple or Spotify, for instance. Usually people don't have both. Where are they listening to most of their podcasts? And you don't want to have to put every single link to every single podcast player. There are also podcast players that, depending on your country, will be more popular. So, for instance, Castbox is not something that maybe the Canadian landscape talks about a lot, but has been seeing a lot of traction in the US. And so taking these sorts of things into account and being able to promote your podcast on these specific platforms. And also research shows most recently that people learn about new audio podcasts from within their podcast player. So being able to then position yourself for promotion within your ideal podcast player or multiple audio podcast players is going to help that audio go up. So being able to submit for Apple promotion and then being listed on, let's say, a new and noteworthy category, that's going to have a huge impact on your audio listenership. But you can see how there's a lot of work that comes with each, and you have to, it's very hard to be firing on all cylinders, especially if you're just doing it on your own.
And if you're an entrepreneur running a business at the same time.
Yeah.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Tell us quickly, how do you make a smart link?
So if you just Google make a smart link, there'll be lots that comes up. I think the most popular one was from Chartable, but Chartable has announced that they are sunsetting at the end of the year, which is unfortunate. I know, but there's lots of alternatives. So if you just Google up smart link, you're going to see a bunch that you'll be able to do, and you could create it for free.
I'm sure ChatGPT can help with that too.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about how to create buzz, growing your show, podcasting, and shout out to the host of Grow Your Show, who was talking in a recent episode about how the podcasting world is so decentralized that there's no one place you can go to be like, this is how this podcast is doing. It's not like YouTube where you can open up my YouTube and say, okay, she has this many subscribers, this podcast got this many views. You can't really tell, but the podcaster themselves can. And when you think about comparison syndrome and how your show's doing in comparison to others, you can have a very skewed understanding of where your show stands in the podcasting landscape. So tell us a little bit about how you overcome that and what are the best strategies to grow your show, especially when it's new.
I think this is one of the beauties of podcasting, to be honest. It's like, think about YouTube. And if you were to land on a video that had 1 million views versus a video that had 12 views, which one would you be more likely to click? You obviously want to see the one that has 1 million views. You're like, this is basically viral. What's going on? And it skews your opinion of the content before you even click. Where podcasts, those numbers are not public. And so it's amazing because it also means that somebody who's making a grassroots independent show could get a same amount of clicks as someone who already has 1 million clicks. So I think there is a beauty to having the numbers hidden. But of course, it does make it tough to set goals for success, know how you're doing amongst others. And it is decentralized in the sense that we don't even know how many podcasts are out there. We can't even define the term. Are we counting YouTube podcasts? And then if you're up on YouTube and Spotify, are you counting that as two separates? And then like Spotify versus Apple don't share their own numbers. So you know how many are on Spotify, you know how many are Apple, but then you can't just add those together because some are on both. It's like such a wild, wild west, which is also exciting. But also can be frustrating. And I get it. I work in the industry. But I would say that's why it's important to set your own goals first and foremost, whether that's a number or whether that's a goal that's connected to your call to action at the end of your episode. So for instance, if you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to if you just want to get people to your websites because you want to build brand affinity and awareness and reach, then make sure you have your website /podcast and then track clicks to that exact URL and see how it is increasing as you promote your podcast. And that can be your own measure of success, right? And it doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. That's your goal. And that's like your own benchmark that you can make year over year and track. When you're looking at listening numbers, if you really want to have a sense of where how your podcast is doing, you could go look on listen notes. This website is really good because it doesn't tell you exact number of listeners, but it tells you if you're in the top 10% or the top 1%, or it tells you like a top percentage margin, which I find helpful. And it's actually still honors not giving away all the numbers, but you can get a sense of which podcasts are maybe that are rising to top and worth using as an example to model after. And if you go to your hosting site, so wherever your audio is living, a lot of hosting sites will share data about the average number of downloads of shows hosted on that hosting platform. And that can provide a great benchmark for you as you are just wondering, like, what is a good number? And so every hosting platform has their own numbers, but you could easily search this. So an example of a hosting platform is Buzzsprout. And if you search average listeners on Buzzsprout podcast, you're going to see their full breakdown.
Yeah. And I love that it's decentralized and that the vanity metrics are hidden.
Yeah.
Because don't we know the mental health effects of seeing other creators on social media platforms? Oh, they have more followers, they have more views, their content isn't as good, or their content's so much better, or whatever it is. So as a podcaster, really, you are comparing yourself to yourself, right?
Exactly.
So you can see the metrics of your own show. So you mentioned Apple promotion and stuff like that. What are your top tips for promoting your show? Because the logical thing is you go on your social media channels, hey, look, I have this new episode. Maybe you have an excerpt, like a clip, a teaser clip, which I would always promote. And then you're like, here's the link. But what are the best ways to promote your podcast?
In addition to those tactics, which are good ones, I would say that one great tactic that you could use is to do a host swap. So where you're having the host of another podcast on your show and then you host on their show. And ideally, this is a show that is targeting a similar audience to yours. And then you can do some audience sharing. This is becoming very popular in podcasting, also with what we call a feed drop, which would mean you actually give a full episode of your show to drop onto their feed. They would give you an episode to drop on your feed. You're cross promoting. And so this sort of tactic now, it's funny. The technology still hasn't caught up. Like, this is happening all the time. It would be amazing if you could just like put in a link and have it like automatically sync and have that episode synced up to your feed. It's impossible right now. You have to literally ask for their audio and then upload it yourself. I'm sure this will change very soon.
Someone will solve that problem.
Right? Come on. Someone has got to be listening to this that can solve that. But yes, you would actually do a feed drop where you're swapping episodes and then you would promote. And this tactic has been used for years and years and years. It's very, very effective. And then the last one is, like I said, promoting within the podcast player. So sometimes that means paying for a promotional spot within a podcast player. And sometimes it just means submitting. Depending what country you are in, it's different everywhere. So for instance, here in Canada, you can't submit to Spotify to be featured. But in the US, you can. So just take a look at where you are, what platform you're wanting to get promoted within. And even if you just Google promote US podcast within Spotify, it's going to come up and it's like a submission form. In Canada, you could definitely do it with Apple pretty easily. And I've also seen a lot of success with promoting my shows within Castbox. So that's why I mentioned them earlier, because I've seen just like overnight success with getting a banner placement there. So I think it just depends from an audio perspective. Those would be some big key tips from me.
And when you say Apple new and noteworthy, how long, or is there like a deadline that, okay, you're not new anymore?
I know, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because what is the definition of new? So really, there is no hard and fast rule. What they do say is if you're new, like even up till within 10 episodes, you could be promoting it. But if you take a break and then you come back, you are also new again. Right? So if you were to say you broke, like for instance, just because of this timing, holidays are coming up. If you took a little pause, called that the end of your season, and then you started a new season in January, you can then submit for new and noteworthy again. So you could kind of spin it.
So maybe I'll do that because I didn't get a chance to do it. And I think this is episode 22 or 23.
There you go. Do it. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. I saved probably the best for last because a lot of us are entrepreneurs. We want to make money. Let's talk about monetization. What are the best ways to monetize your podcast? And there's a lot of people that wonder, is it cool to have sponsors if you get to that stage? I don't know about you, but I fast forward through commercials all the time. I won't listen to them. I press that fast forward button. Tell us all the things about monetization that you would give as advice, especially to those who are just getting into it.
I think the monetization piece is still evolving very quickly. And there's lots of new ways to monetize now. There will probably be new ways very soon. But essentially, there's two ways that ads can be inserted into your show. One is called baked in. So that's where the host is literally doing the plug, saying the ad. And this is how ads were done in the initial days. And it would be a higher price point because that ad would be in that podcast always. It's baked right into the audio. And we found that those ads were actually very effective, and less people fast forwarded through them because they became almost integrated into the show. The host would really make it unique and funny, and it would be like an added bonus to hear how they present this ad. Then there became another tactic, which is more recent, but also great because it's very easy to be able to monetize by using digital ad insertion, DAI. So this is where an ad would be like dropped into your show and then it could be yanked out at any time. It's great because it means you could sell that same ad spot multiple times. But at the same time, there is a little bit more tech know-how that has to come with that. So you could either create your own ad to be dropped in, or you could sign up through your hosting platform to have them drop ads in, just like how you could sign up for YouTube ads, right? And they'll put the ads in, and then you're getting a revenue share and getting a couple pennies for every ad, depending on how many listeners you have. But it does take a longer time to hit some of those bigger revenues because you really have to have a lot of people listening. It's very, very similar to YouTube. So they've just taken that model and put that in the podcasting landscape. The other third option, and I talk about this in the book because I've done this specifically, and it's lesser known, is called faked in, which is you make it sound, it is the host still reading it. It sounds like it's baked in because of the way you fade the music and you come in and out of, you know what your first word is on the episode and you know how to end the ad. And so you can actually have it a digital ad insertion that is faked into the episode that sounds baked in. And so, yes, I recently did that as well on one of my podcasts. And I think that's really effective because it kind of gets the best of both worlds.
And then, of course, there's you don't use ads, but you're trying to get people onto your email list. Perhaps you have a program, an offering of some sort that you can put in the show notes. You push to that at some point in the show. How effective do you find that is?
Oh, I find it very effective. I actually think that might be, especially if you're an entrepreneur looking to help with a business goal, I would say put your efforts in using your podcast to promote your business rather than putting your efforts into selling ads on your podcast, to be honest. And there's also Patreon, which is a lot of people use too, to like get people subscribed, right? But you're building a community around the podcast where I guess it depends what your business is. But if you have any sort of other offer, I would say use your podcast as a more high level part of the funnel to drive people to that, because we know that 60% of people have bought something that they heard about on a podcast. Podcasts are excellent for driving trust, intimacy, growth, authenticity, and brand recognition. And so people are expecting a call to action at the end of the episode. They're ready for it. Every episode, even if it's not with a business, has a call to action. And so strategically write that call to action. And this is why I say you should script your outro, because you should have this nailed down and really specific, and point people somewhere where they're going to either engage with you further and then get an ask for something that you could sell them, or directly to something that you might want to sell them that would be beneficial based on the information you shared on the podcast.
I love that. So much great information. So I loved your first book, Let's Talk Podcasting. You have created a second edition. Give us the high level. What is different? What is this new edition? And what are your observations about, how this book is different than the first one?
For sure. The first book came out in 2018, so lots has changed since then, as I've already alluded to throughout this episode. There's 6 new chapters, 10,000 new words, lots of extra information. I really did an overhaul on the book, and mainly because the industry has really boomed, so there's more to talk about. Some things stay the same, like structural pieces around building your show and doing show development. You know, the best practices are the best practices. But I have equipment recommendations. Okay, well, let me take you through. The book has 5 parts, same as the first one. So there's a foundation talking about how we got there, the evolution of podcasting. And then we have what's out there, best practices. So if you've even never listened to a podcast, you can have some recommendations for what you should check out. Or if you're more well-versed, maybe some new shows you haven't heard of. Then we do a look ahead, what the future holds, and that, of course, I had to completely overhaul. And I do some predictions. Then we get into how to do it. That's all the technical information and equipment recommendations. And then finally, it's a behind the scenes. And so in my first edition, I had 2 behind the scenes of 2 shows I had made and how I made them. Now I've added 3 new chapters to that section, mainly because I've made more shows. And so specifically even talking about how I made a #1 Apple ranked show in Canada and pulling back the curtain on exactly how I did that. So, and that show's called How to Fall Asleep Fast. And, you know, one little tidbit of a giveaway is that I really took SEO into account for this one, and how to fall asleep fast is the #1 search term in connection to sleep in the US, UK, Australia, and Canada. And so I built the website and the show all around that research. And then the show itself is just like a 1-minute meditation from me and then some dreamy music. So even that, the music is pushing the boundaries of the medium, because a lot of people think of podcasts as talking, and this is mainly music as a podcast. So yeah, it's very interesting, but it performed very well. So we were happy with that.
Amazing. And where can people get the book?
You could go to letstalkpodcasting.com, and it's linked, all the places it's available is linked there. It's available as a paperback, an ebook, and an audiobook. And so it's really exciting and available all over the world. So hopefully you'll be able to find a copy that's closest to you.
I love it. I'm an audiobook girl all the way, so I'll listen to it while I'm driving. I can't wait.
Oh, wow.
We will link that in the show notes below. Amanda, thank you so much for your time. If you could leave everybody with one takeaway, if they remember one thing about this episode, what is that going to be?
I would say, don't be afraid to get started, but get started with a strategic mindset.
Okay. I like it. I like it a lot. Well, the book has all the nuts and bolts. We can't wait to tune in. And I can't wait to have you back again as podcasting evolves. There's always so much more. We should do another episode where we hone in maybe on one aspect of it, because we covered the kitchen sink. Thank you so much for your time, and really loved having you here on the Camera Confident podcast.
Thank you so much, Shirlee.
Wow, so many juicy takeaways that I plan on implementing in my own podcast, so stay tuned. Thank you so much, Amanda, for that amazing interview, and congrats on the book. If you are an existing podcaster or you're looking to get started with podcasting, something you're gonna wanna master is the voice. How do you speak like a pro and get that velvety sound that all those great podcasters have? Well, you'll want to check out this episode, because I talked to Susan Murphy, a voice coach and former broadcaster, about how to do just that.